Today we're going to have two presentations, one from MacGregor, of the Managing Director of Corinthian Benefits, and then a presentation from myself showing you some financial planning case studies. If you've got any questions, we will answer them at the end, but if you could write them in the chat box, that would be ideal. And now I will leave you in the very capable hands of Robert.
Morning. I hope we're all well and staying safe. This is an interesting presentation, certainly an interesting title. I've been doing it for a few months, well, about a year or so now, I guess, at different times. And the last time I worked with Beaufort was in January, giving this presentation in Basingstoke in what seems like a galaxy far, far away and a long time ago. I kind of wondered if it was a bit incongruous, really, but actually most of the stuff that we'll be talking about, I think still applies, but perhaps with a little twist. And anyway, that would be for you to judge. So let's kick off. Basically, the starting point is the idea that we are living longer. A child born in 2014 had a 50% chance of living to over 105. A child born in 1914 had just a 1% chance. So we are all living a lot longer. What does that kind of mean? Just to show some of the effects of that. In 1963, so the Japanese, we have the telegram that goes from the Queen. In Japan, they get given a silver sake dish when they get to 100. And in 1963, there was about 153 of these issued, and in 2014, there were over 29,000. Talking about the telegrams from the Queen, in 2000, one person was organising them. And now I don't know whether this is just because they were less good at organising the telegrams, or there was a lot more of them. I'd like to think it was the latter for the purposes of this. The Sakazuki tradition of giving the sake dish was cancelled. How's that come about? Well, if we go back to the 19th century and life in the 1860s, it was quite simple, really. You were young. If you were lucky, you were young and didn't have to work until you were about 12. Sometimes for some unfortunates, quite a lot of unfortunates, it was a bit younger than that, but broadly it was about 12. And then you went to work, and typically you worked on either a farm, in a mine, or in a factory or workhouse. And you did that for the next sort of 30 years or so, 35 years, and around about mid-late 40s, you basically cast off your mortal coil. So it's a very simplistic, not very long, life back in the 60s. Thanks to huge improvements in two key areas, child mortality and adult diseases, things changed dramatically over the next 100 years. And if we run forward 100 years to the 1960s, then of course you were still young. I'm showing my age here with the Brady Bunch, which just happens to be the name of our family WhatsApp group now. But the Brady Bunch, so you were young until you were about mid-teens, mid-late teens. But then in the 1960s, we created an entirely new group of people with a new name, and these were teenagers. We didn't have those before this, post-war sort of period. They didn't exist because people just again went straight to work. So you were young for a bit longer, through to about sort of your early 20s. Then of course you went to work, but this being the 1960s, more often than not you didn't go to work. For those of us who can remember that. But you worked till you were about 65, or actually 60 if you're a woman, and 65 if you're a man, very clearly defined back in those days. And then we created a second entirely new group of people during the late 20th century. And these were pensioners. They hadn't existed either in any great number. And these, you were a pensioner for probably about 10 to 15 years. Until about sort of 75, 80-ish, and then, obviously passed on. If we look at that, what was created throughout the 20th century was a very rigid structure called a three-stage life. Meet Mervyn Thomas. Mervyn Thomas was born in 1913. At the age of 27, he went off to war. He was a radio operator in a short Sunderland flying boat. He had a bit of an interesting war, by all accounts, doing all sorts of things in North Africa and out over the Atlantic. When the war finished, he came back. He met Olive. They had 3 children, the third of which was my wife. Mervyn retired at 65. He was a carpenter when he came back from the war. He was a carpenter till he was 65, and then he actually had a decent retirement. He lived for a bit longer than the 15 years that most people, probably about nearly 25 years, and then passed on. So he lived that classic three-stage life. He was young. He did stay on at school. He worked, retired, and died. And the challenge with this three-stage life is it's kind of defined everything we think about life now, because we tend to look at what happened and what it was like in our younger years, for certain those of us born in the 20th century. And there are a number of issues there. Firstly, lockstep. Age defined your life stage. If you were young, you were at school or you were learning. If you were in the middle, you were working. And if you were old, you were retired. We even created places where these people would live and exist. So we called them schools and universities. We called them offices. We moved out of the mines and the farms. And then we called them retirement homes. And it was very segregated. And so there wasn't much integration at all between ages. The average working time had come down to 40 hours. It was something like about 55 plus in the 19th century. And we had more time for recreation. Didn't always feel like it, because quite often we were traveling to work over significant distances and times, which again didn't tend to happen an awful lot in the 19th century. Relationships were interesting. Families were still large. We still had lots of kids. But relationships in the 20th century, were based on what we call production complementaries. And I guess one of the things that sums it up was the Janet Jackson song in the 1980s of "What Have You Done For Me Lately?" So people got together because of what they brought to the relationship. And fundamentally, throughout most of that century, it was that the husband brought the earning power and the money, and the wife basically looked after the kids and looked after the house. Unsurprisingly, because of the fact that they were getting together almost because of not their personal reasons, divorce rates increased dramatically throughout the 20th century, because you get to the point where you think, what are we doing together again? Now we've had our kids. If we scroll forwards and look at the impact of the stuff we've been talking about, the fact that we are now going to live longer. Over the last 200 years, life expectancy has increased by something like 2 to 3 years per decade. And if you look at the stats, it's pretty consistent. So someone 20 now has got a 50% chance of living to 100, 40, 50% chance of living to 95. And someone of 60, so someone just about my age, has got a 50% chance of living to 90. So we're going to be around for some time. It's not about the fact that people are able to live longer. People have always been able, the human being has always been able to live to around about plus or minus 100. The change is in morbidity, is in the things that stop you getting there. So mortality hasn't changed, but morbidity has. So science over the last few hundred years has done a fantastic job at dealing with the stuff that would otherwise stop us getting to the maximum age that we're able to get to. And the other thing about this is that it's not that if we're going to live longer, we're not going to be all, sort of the kind of perception of old age pensions that we have. We are getting healthier too. One of the measures of the health of particularly older people is a thing called the index called the activities of daily living. It measures a whole load of functions of people. And as you can see, in 1984, 22% of 85 to 89-year-olds were classified as disabled. Just 20 years later, that was down to 12%. And for over 95s, in 1984, it was 52%, and that had come down in 20 years to 31%. So we're living longer, we're healthier, and what's that going to mean for us? Well, are we going to retire for longer? What that means is if we still retired at 60, which is kind of the age, 60, 65 is the age that is in everyone's mind, and the thing we all get excited about when the government talks about increasing it by 1 or even 2 years to 67. That means we're going to be around for 40 years if as I say, we would manage to retire at 65. Now, one of the key issues, though, is how are we going to pay for that? Well, if we wanted a 50% retirement income at 65, that's going to cost us something like 34% of our earnings throughout our working life, because we're going to have to build up a huge amount of money to be able to sustain us for 40 years. I guess the alternative is, if we can't afford that, is are we going to work for longer? So we're going to work and still just have that 10 to 15 years of retirement at the end. Well, if we're working for 60 years, clearly we're going to be knackered to start with. Can we fund it? Well, yes, we can. If at current average retirement savings rates of about 12%, which is a bit above the minimum auto enrollment rate, then you would be able to sustain a 50% income from about 85, your mid-80s. Obviously, there's no guarantees. It depends on what you do with your income. I think what's really going to happen, though, it's kind of Goldilocks. We looked at the biggest and the smallest in terms of whether length of retirement or working life. It's this Goldilocks thing in the middle. I think what's going to have to happen is we're all going to have to change and it is all of us, even those, I'm 58. It's not just the 20-year-olds that are going to have to change our relationship with work, life, retirement, and indeed change our relationship with relationships. We're going to focus more on, I think, over time, and it's already happening, by the way. You can see it amongst younger people because they're the most affected by this. Recreation, not recreation, but recreating ourselves. Mervyn Thomas was able to sustain his entire working life on the knowledge he built up in a very short period of time after he came back from the war, learning how to be a carpenter. How many careers or jobs can we think of that would not change? In other words, you'll know everything you need to know about it within the first few years of your working at that, and it sustains you for the next 40 or even 60 years. It's not going to happen. With the pace of change, we are going to have to recreate ourselves. Will we be even doing the same job? There was a World Health Organization report recently, and they said that 60% of children in primary school today will start work at a job that doesn't exist today. And that's a role, not just the company's a new company. So we'll be focusing on recreation, intangibles. If we're living that long, we're going to want a better quality of life. We're going to want to live it and enjoy it. Lockstep, I think, will be disengaged. Things like education won't just be for those up to the age of about 21, 22, maybe 23, 24 if you do a master's. We'll be, as part of this recreation, we'll be taking time off to learn a new career, learn a new job, just do some learning for the sake of it. I think that gap years again won't be the preserve of students that are lucky enough to have parents that can help fund it. I think the idea of academics take sabbaticals. I think that more of us will be starting to do that, to take that. It might not be a year, but it might be 3 months, 6 months, but it might be a year to just draw a breath, relax, breathe before we change career or go back to work. So Lockstep will be massively disengaged. We'll be much more engagement with all the different age groups. Have no idea how average working time, will it come down? And we've seen that over the current period. The fact that one of the things is that we've gained is the number of hours a day we would otherwise have spent traveling to and from work. A large number of us have gained that. What do we want to give that back? There might be issues about working from home full time, but those hours that we suddenly realise actually you don't have to get up at 0 o'clock so that I can get to work to miss the traffic. kind of stuff. So all these are going to have impacts on the work and the quality of work and the type of jobs we do. Relationships, I think we're going to get smaller families, because fundamentally, if you're going to live for a long time, a couple of issues are going to come into factor here. That you'll be around when not just your grandchildren, but potentially your great-grandchildren. So you don't need millions of children in your family, in your direct family, to have lots of children in your extended family. We are already marrying later, and divorce rates are reducing. Actually, divorce rates peaked around the end of the late 1990s, and have been reducing ever since. And that's mainly because we're getting together later, we're getting together more aware, we're getting together because we want to. We're getting together because of what's called consumption complementaries. So we're getting together because we're doing things together that we both like. And that's what's bringing us together, rather than we have to get together because I need someone who's going to go to work, or you need someone who's going to look after the house. So this is going to have a significant impact on people, all of us, and how we live our lives. But what does that mean to you, to people who run businesses, or as senior people in business or own businesses? Well, the reality is that most businesses need people. There are a small minority that clearly don't. And there's also a difference in the attitude of the people that own the business to their people. And this is using this highly scientific scale at one end that says, my people are a means to an end. If I could get rid of them and automate them, I would. They mean nothing to me. All the way through to, if I could take them home at weekends, I would. They mean everything to me. Now, actually, most businesses are somewhere in the middle. But spoiler alert, if you are right down the bottom end there, probably the next few slides aren't that relevant to you. But most businesses, and even as we go through, with all the AI automation, further automation, what we've always found is that it's not a case of the jobs that are taken away. It's the new jobs that are created to sit around the new technologies and the new developments that are produced. So they will still need companies, and companies will still need people. And people need benefits. If a large proportion of them are going to live to 100, then they're going to need to fund that, whether that's through pay, but also through some sort of retirement income and other things to interrupt it. If we're living longer, unfortunately, there are some illnesses that they are slowly reducing, but that we will get. So we'll need assistance in that way. But despite all that, 75% of adults today have no life cover. And again, despite the amazing efforts, as we've all seen over the past few months, of our NHS and care services, they are still under pressure, and waiting times for non-critical urgent stuff are significant. Companies also need benefits. Sickness and absence cost employers, this is a few years out of date, so it's probably bigger than that now, 16 billion a year. 53% of businesses say they'd cease trading within 12 months in the death of a key person. This is mainly SMEs rather than obviously multinationals. Half of businesses have no arrangements regarding shares on death. We looked at that as ourselves, Corinthian, 4 or 5 years ago. If you haven't, it's an absolute minefield. You must. And 65%, again, this stat is slightly out of date. There aren't bang up to date stats. I would imagine that number's much higher now. Both of those numbers, the percentage you have debt and the amount of that debt. The key piece here is what's in place in the event of the death of perhaps the person on whom that debt is put, who's got the second charge, etc. So what are benefits? Well, benefits are anything really, anything that you provide for your staff. We've kind of chunked them into 4 key areas. Core, which is the fundamentals. If you come to work, we'll give you some money. Actually, for about 4 to 5 weeks of the year, you don't even have to come to work, and we'll still give you some money. And actually, if you're ill, we'll give you some money as well. We now have to give you a pension because of auto enrollment, and we'll give you somewhere to work. And actually, right now, that might be at home, but then there's things that we'll need to do to make sure that that's suitable for you to work. Although, as a new norm, however we can't come through this, perhaps even both of those, you might need an office space and the ability to work from home for each person. Then you've got the explicit stuff. So this will be in the contract of employment, but you don't have to provide it. So things like bonuses, overtime, specific flexi time, hours that you specifically move, things like protection, life cover, etc., and exam policy. We have it's a significant part of our benefits. Then there's the implicit stuff. It's not in the contract of employment. Things like Christmas party, we all do it. Christmas for most shops starts about October, November. In my company, planning for the Christmas party starts around February. So we have no break from Christmas at Corinthian. You've got parking. If you expect them to drive to work, then you've got to give them somewhere to park. Training, if you expect them to get better at what they do. Coffee, again, one of the biggest issues is it's not, when I first started work, it was a cup of brown sludge with lumps in it, where the congealed powder from the disgusting machine used to drop off the pipes occasionally. Now it's barista coffee, single roast, single origin beans, and frothy milk. And then there's the soft stuff, the really soft stuff. So this is soft flexi time, things like, well, you got in late today, but don't worry, I know you're fine, and you were working late the other day. Fruit, Easter eggs, and soft office equipment. So the missing pens, paper, etc. So companies do provide more than they think. You probably provide more than that in yourself in a specific level. But the key piece here is, do your employees realise? Do they understand, A, what you've got, and B, what it does for them? What have you done for me lately? So a couple of things we all need to do. Communicate correctly. Communicate correctly. And that will mean different things to different people, particularly now, increasingly with technology, with multimedia. It's not just about a piece of paper once a year. But the starting point, understand what you provide. Have an audit of what all the stuff you give, anything that has a cash value, that costs you money, that your staff get, your employees get. Help understand your employees and where they're coming from. And then tell them. Sorry, showing my age here again. So tell them what you're going to tell them the stuff, and then tell them what you've told them. Keep communicating. Don't stop. And cover all media. It isn't, in this modern world, different people will take in things different way. You can send out as much paper as you like, but if the people you're sending to don't read that stuff, then you might as well not have told them at all. Likewise, you can have the best website, intranet site in the world. If you've got people that just don't take information in that way, then they won't be getting it. So once you've understood what they've got and told them what they've got, then actually make sure that you pay in the right way. And just one example here, because it still amazes me. We've got something like about 800 corporate clients, or all of whom use this. But when we talk to new companies, I'm still amazed how few people use it. This is really simplistic. This is just one example of pension contributions. Now, we all have to have a pension, and at the bare minimum, company has to put in 3% of pay and the employee has to put in 5%. But there is a way that you can reconfigure that means that both the employee and you as the employer will make money out of this at no cost and no difference to the underlying benefits. That thing is called salary exchange. It's very simple. It's an HMRC approved term, and it just is a different way of making the employee contribution. So under normal circumstances, so that's the one on the right, that's David. So under normal circumstances, and this is roughly the amount for someone on national average earnings at 5%, will be paying £100 a month. They get basic rate income tax added to it, or if you're paying gross, the 125 would come out of pay, and they would get 25% tax relief. The net effect's exactly the same. The net cost to David would be £100 for 125 being invested. If you change the order of events, which is all salary sacrifice or salary exchange is that you turn an employee contribution into a company contribution. If I work for you, instead of you paying me the money, and in my pay slip, the money comes in, and then there's a specific amount for pension contributions. I give up the pension contribution. You don't pay it to me, but you put it in for me. That's all it is. Because of that, I didn't get paid it. I didn't pay national insurance on it. So I will save £15. So what that means is my net cost then is £85 for 125 to be invested, as opposed to 100. I'm £15 better off. No change, goes into the same pension, exactly the same way, no change to anything else. In addition to that, you as the employer will save £17.25. So £17.25 a month for each employee who's on that salary. So what we're talking about is something like it's about £200 to £250 a month per employee, a year, sorry, per employee that does this. So if you've got 10 employees, it's a saving of 2 to 2.5, 20 employees, 5,000, etc. We have companies, we have clients that have several hundred employees that are saving tens, and in a couple of cases, very high teens, nearly £100,000 a year just by doing this. No one's affected. So make sure that you're paying the right amounts, make sure that any benefits you're paying for, that you look at how much you're paying, and specifically stuff like this. So then once it's then, you've got to invest correctly. If I'm going to have my money invested for potentially 85, 60 or 70 or 80 years or longer, then put it in the right place. This is a very simplistic graph, but it just shows the difference for that person, again, that earlier person, starting saving at 25 on put on £30,000 a year, putting in the bare minimum, the 8% into their pension, and the difference between it growing at 2, 5, and 8%. Now, there's no guarantees, obviously, it's all subject to where, but it is about being careful about where you're investing, how you're investing, to maximize the returns that are appropriate for you. I'm not saying we can all go out and get 8%, that's highly unlikely, certainly over a 60-year period on average, but just looking at the difference between even 5 and 2% is the difference between having a fund of £1 million or £300,000, which is a massive difference. There's no impact on inflation in that, it's just a flat rate, because obviously I have no idea what inflation is going to be over the next 60 years. So spend correctly, invest correctly, and then manage correctly. And this is where we're going to link into what Ash is going to show you later. This is, if we're going to live for longer, we've got to manage our incomings, our outgoings, and our assets absolutely as effectively as we possibly can, because that will make the difference between whether, for instance, I can even take a sabbatical, or that sabbatical lasts 3 months or 4 months or 1 week. Or all aspects of our life, whether I can retire at 85 or 80 or 75, etc. And so this is really crucial. This is this is just a diagram, but Ash is going to go into a lot more detail. This is the technology that advisors have now that can help you maximize and plan really far more effectively into the future about the specific investments you're making in specific areas, looking at all of them and all of your different outgoings. So Ash is going to go into that later. So what's in it for you? Well, there's two main areas really, I guess. One of which is something that, again, this maybe appear to be a bit incongruous right now, when we've got significant potential unemployment in a few months' time, and therefore a buyer's market from the jobs, but staff turnover. And I think it isn't incongruous to the extent that we all have staff turnover, but the reality is there are people that we grade who those people are. There are people that are staff turnover, and we 2 years later you probably even forgot they worked for you. But there's also people who, crikey, that was the worst thing that ever happened to this business, losing that person. And it's a scale again, and there'll be different people at different points on it. So I think staff turnover is still going to be important, but it's also something that we won't want to have too high. It doesn't help our culture. It doesn't help us grow the business, and it's also, as this will show, more expensive perhaps than we think. So this is a typical sort of SME, 40 employees, average salary £30,000. So that the normal people working a normal working week. And this company, if you ask the person, they'd say, yeah, staff turnover is about 10%. Yeah, what does that mean? Chances are it's probably higher. There will be a couple of people that you'll forget because they weren't there for very long. What does that mean? In the explicit costs, so most SMEs will be, local, looking after the local community, and if they're like me, you will still advertise in the local paper. You've never recruited anyone through that local paper, but you want to support the local paper. and it's a little bit of advertising on the side as well to show you're growing. So we might place an ad there, but certainly my business, and I know most businesses, otherwise it wouldn't be such a thriving recruitment industry, that we use recruitment agencies. Let's assume that the agency fee in this case is 10%. In our industry, it's 20 plus, which is always a great check that you write when you have to. Obviously, we'll need to interview these people that we're looking to make sure we get the right ones. So the tangible cost there, something like about 14,330. Now, if at the end of the year you looked at that, you would think that is a lot of money. I wish I hadn't spent that. But it isn't the only thing that it costs you. There are intangible costs to this. So people don't suddenly wake up in the morning and decide to leave. People have been building up to that over time. As this is a truism, people don't leave because of money. They leave because of the environment, the manager, etc. So what that means is they would have been disenchanted. If we assume that they were disenchanted for something like about 6 weeks, they will not have been working at full chat for that period. Let's assume it's 50%. Let's assume a short notice period of 4 weeks, and during that period they definitely will not be working effectively. But let's just assume it's still 50% in between planning their leaving do, etc. And then 5 days unexpected absence. This is when you suddenly find out all about all of their distant relatives that are ill or have died, etc. The funerals whilst they go to interviews. Then when you recruit someone, let's say that you interview 3 people, the induction is 1 week. So they're certainly not effective during that period. They're trying to learn people's names, let alone what they actually have to do. And then the training period, again, ours is significantly longer. It's something like about 6 months, but let's assume it's 4 weeks. And during that period, they're 50%. So what would that cost just at those levels? And I think that it would be very easy to speak to people to have different numbers on that. That's an intangible cost of something like about £22,000. So what we're actually saying, the cost to your business, you didn't write this check, but the cost to your business would be something like about £36,000 or £9,000 per leaver. Now, a couple of those you'd be happy to leave, but there'll be at least 1, maybe 2 a year that you think, we didn't want them. They were really good. What would you pay? What would you do to stop that? And that's, again, we need to think about that. We need to think about it in the context of what they want. It's not necessarily, particularly for millennials, just giving them more money. It's making them feel better, making them feel that there's a future for them, etc. It's training. These people are hoovers for learning, and I think there's just different ways we need to think about that cost and how we might apply it in a better way. And then finally, the ultimate bit is what's in it for you. Well, if you protect the staff and you protect the thing about the shareholder protection, loan cover, etc. If you do grow your people, if you build morale, if you will get it back in productivity. You will get that discretionary effort, that working late, etc. And of course, what does all of that do? Well, it gives you. It helps your business in the way that I guess most of us that are in business want to be helped ultimately. So it's not simple. The answer's simple. Oh, sorry, the end bit's simple. The journey's difficult. The journey's interesting, but it is about understanding your staff. So one of the things we talked about was the idea that we've got to manage our assets, our outgoings, our incomes. We've got to manage ourselves almost like a business and have a financial plan. So these are going to become vital as we move forwards. And so for the next session, I'm going to hand over to Ash, who's going to talk you through how these things work and how they can help you.
Perfect. Thank you very much for that. And as I said at the beginning, anyone, if you've got any questions, please write them in the text box, and we can answer them at the end. So in line with sort of the 100-year life that's just been spoken about by Robert, really what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you 3 different case studies based on people sort of living to 100. And unfortunately, we can't predict when people do leave this earth, but we do factor that in going forward. So out of the 3 case studies, the first case study you can see here is the family, Adrian and Bella, the grandparents, their son Charles, their daughter-in-law Davina, and their 2 grandchildren, Francesca and Eddie. So what we do with all of our clients, for those who are clients or have seen sort of similar presentations before, is we go out and we ask them questions about what they have in terms of, here we can see they've got savings and cash ISAs, premium bonds as well, often a fan favorite. We find out their investments, what they've got in terms of ISAs, any investment accounts, then their pensions and property. If they've got a mortgage, for example, that would also be included, any life cover and things like that, and any income they have. So Adrian and Bella here are retired. They previously owned a business. They've got state pension paying. Bella's got an old work final salary scheme. And actually what they've been doing is they've been using their savings to top up anything else they need in their expenditure. Said here, we look at their expenditure. So really that is them in terms of what you could probably find out from their bank account in terms of, from a bank statement. What do you have? What do you spend? Which is sort of the starting point we do for all of our clients. And then Robert showed you one before. We look at their cash flow. We call it financial master plan, whatever you want to call it. And in here, this looks at them now and going forward, and we can really factor in anything they want in there. So, for example, holidays may change the amount they spend, or if they're looking to make gifts, which we'll really go into now. I don't know if you can sort of see here, there's lots of different colours which represent where different money comes from. So from pensions, from savings. There's no red, which would show shortfall. So in this situation, if they're now 70, if they live from now to 100, how are they affected? Can they do what they want to do based on this? And the answer is yes. We can also show them their net worth and what their inheritance tax liability is going to be, which is really important as well. The reason this is important is we can see actually their net worth goes up every single year. The reason being is we've got assumptions. We assume that inflation is 2.5%. We assume that investment growth is 4% and that anything in cash grows at 1%. So you can actually see here that the day they are richest is the day they pass away. So really, financial planning has moved on sort of over the last 10, 15 years in terms of, it's not just about what people have, but it's actually about what they want to do. We as financial planners at Beaufort spend a lot of our time with clients asking questions about what is it you want from a financial advisor? You know, what are your goals? Do you want to give money away? Do you want to help your children now? As we can see with this family here, if they don't do anything now, their children or whoever they want to pass the money on to will receive it. They've got a liquid estate, they don't have any shortfall, and their net worth is rising year on year. However, they're currently 70, their children are their son's 40, and their grandchildren are, are both under 10. So if they can, could they help their grandchildren now? So we ask clients questions such as, what is it you want? Do you want to give money away now? Do you want to try and mitigate your inheritance tax? What is it you want to do? And really, these were the questions that came up here. And also care home fees. Care home planning is something that is becoming more and more prevalent. As Robert said, people are living longer. The chance of going into a care home does seem to be on the increase, and care homes are notoriously expensive. The average is around £1,500 a month, but you can spend £5,000 a month plus. It really depends on what you want, whether you would want to go into a care home, whether you'd want living care. All those sort of questions do come up. But really, these were the goals and worries that they had going forward. So what we then do is find out actually a bit more about them and give them some advice. Holidays, as an example, they said, actually, for the next 10 years, we still feel young, fit and able. The next 10 years, we're going to spend £15,000 a year on holidays. Then we think that'll decrease. We probably won't go away as much, maybe not as long. We'll factor in that we'll decrease that to £10,000 for 5 years, and then £7,500 a year until they said they predicted going into a home. Obviously, you can't predict that, but in this case here, we've said at 90, they would go into a home. Gifting allowance. So the gifting allowance is something that not everyone uses. It basically means you can, each individual person can give away £3,000 per tax year without it having any effect on their the inheritance. So if you haven't actually done last year, you can use last year's allowance as well. But it's a good way to pass on money without there being any inheritance tax implications, and also helping those around you. So in here we've said, well, how about if you each give your son £3,000, he'll receive £6,000 a year, which is obviously a big help to him. We then said, okay, so care home fees, what do you think, what would be a good number? And they said, well, let's look at if we each spent £24,000 a year on care home fees from age 90 till 100, would they be okay? And also as well, they said they wanted to take their grandchild. Often people say, well, the easiest way of doing that is giving the money to the son or the daughter, and then the money will then pass on through. However, there can be complications with that in terms of worst case scenario, they give their son money, their son and their daughter-in-law divorce. In theory, half of that money or more or less could be given to her in the divorce. So they wanted to give money to the grandchildren in an effective way, and that will ensure that it remains for the benefit of the grandchildren. So here the recommendation was to use a discretionary trust, and within it an offshore bond to hold the money. The reason being, obviously, the type of trust depends on what the clients are looking to do, depends on what the need of the underlying money is going to be. However, with a discretionary trust, they can sort of retain control. They can say how the money should be spent, and they can have trustees looking after it. Why an offshore bond? An offshore bond doesn't pay tax on any growth, and also sections can be assigned. So the reason for giving money to the grandchildren was to help with potentially school fees, university fees, housing costs. Well, the grandchildren, although young, still have personal allowances. So actually, it's a very tax efficient way for them to withdraw money without paying tax. And also, by having it within the bond, they can control how much tax they pay. So they may say, well, actually, yes, they need more money this year. We understand the tax position and are happy to accept it. And also, it starts the 7-year clock. So they've given the money away, providing they live 7 years, that money falls outside of their estate for inheritance tax purposes. So looking at their investments, they had stocks and shares ISAs and cash ISAs. The stocks and shares ISA and cash ISAs were introduced to make Britain a saving nation. Again, that was what Gordon Brown's tagline was with them. They're brilliant. You don't pay tax on growth. Everyone understands that. However, they do form part of your estate. People now have quite large ISAs. They've been saving into them year on year with investment growth or with interest they've received. And these have become quite large assets themselves. However, they form part of their estate, potentially 40% inheritance tax. You can invest into what's called an AIM inheritance tax ISA. If you have these for 2 years and at time of death, they are 0 rated for inheritance tax. So potentially a 40% saving for your beneficiaries. They do come with extra risk. They invest into smaller UK companies. However, small is quite a comparative term. The AIM market in the UK is worth 100 billion, and over 25% of the companies within the AIM market are valued at over 1 billion. So they're not sort of small one-person firm, one-person companies in a derelict office. Some of these are very large, but they do have additional risk. They also retain the control of the asset. They may say, well, we're going to put that money into the AIM IST ISA. We don't plan on touching it, but it's still their asset. Should they need the money, they can withdraw it and use it as they want. We also looked at using some of their excess cash to invest into what's called a business relief solution, similar to an AIM inheritance tax ISA. If you have them for 2 years and at time of death, they don't pay inheritance, they're 0 rated and there's no inheritance tax on them. And again, they retain control of the asset. Often, the easiest way to mitigate anyone's inheritance tax position, whoever they are, however much money they have, however big their assets are, is to give the money away. However, that's quite a difficult thing to do for various and often obvious reasons. So while they can retain control of the money and mitigate inheritance tax, that's a win-win for them. So income and withdrawals, as they said, they've been using their savings accounts to top up any expenditure. Often people don't look at their tax position and work out the best way of taking money, and that's something we do at Beaufort. We say, well, actually, how can we make sure you have as much money as you need and pay minimum tax? If you can save tax year on year, it's a big saving. So in this case, we said, well, actually, you're going to have some expenditure. You're putting money into trust. Adrian, you've got a pension. You haven't touched it yet. Take the tax-free cash, pass that money on, and also start taking a small income from it to help top up your expenditure, top up your income for your expenditure. Again, he's a basic rate taxpayer, very little tax to pay. Bella already earning money through the rental income and through the final salary scheme, so she could take some tax-free cash every year from her pension. And then capital gains tax allowance. They've got a joint general investment account. This is one of the allowances that's forgotten, I would say, most when we speak to clients, is everyone has a capital gains tax allowance every year. It's £12,300. So they could start taking money from that account without having to pay any tax. And also as well, if they're taking the money and spending it, it's also reducing their inheritance tax liability. So we've put all of these scenarios into their financial master plan. Really, this is their plan going forward. This includes everything they want to do. We've structured their withdrawals. And as you can see, their expenditure when they get to 90 increases as they start paying for care home fees. But as we can see here, there's no shortfall and everything's okay, even in their eyes, their worst case scenario. So we can then see how this affects their inheritance, their net worth, their inheritance. Yes, their net worth has actually decreased. They've given money away, but they're helping their children now rather than waiting potentially 30, maybe more years until their family is helped. There's no point holding on to the money, in my eyes, if they could help their children, their grandchildren now and see that benefit, rather than going, well, they'll be fine when I go, but they won't be around to see probably the enjoyment of all these things helping their family. So the starting point, do they achieve their goals? Yes, we factored in their holiday change. They're helping their son and their grandchildren now. They're mitigating they're doing everything that they want to do, and they're being more efficient and looking at worst case scenarios. So that's really good. Everything looks well, but really the question is, we give ongoing advice, and the reason is this plan probably changes every single year, maybe every 6 months, depending on what happens in their life. We're looking at a 30-year period for them and a longer period for their children and grandchildren. So the question is, what next? What is it? What else is it you want to do? You've got a rental property. Do you want to keep it? There's potential tax on that if you sell it, but if you don't sell it, there's potentially inheritance tax. And they still have more money in their account even after they've done all of the additional expenditure we've spoken about. So it's really, what else is it you want to do? Every year we revisit these, looking at their inheritance tax position. Is that okay? How can we make it better? So we speak to all of our clients and ask them if they've got a will in place, has been recently looked at or updated, and a lasting power of attorney, and do have joined up meetings with the client's solicitor, but also with the client's family. If in this case here, we've got a couple who are 70, they've got a will in place, a power of attorney in place, but who is the power of attorney? If it's the son, brilliant, and let's sit down and discuss the whole plan, because should anything happen to the parents and they lose capacity, effectively the son is acting on their behalf. But if he didn't know what the plan was before, it's going to be quite difficult for him to catch up on everything that's happened. If they've been clients for 5-10 years and say, well, this is what we're doing and for these reasons why, the earlier everyone's in the same room and discussing it, everyone knows the same picture. Also, that it's a great opportunity for the parents and the son to discuss this and say, well, look, the reasons we're doing this are for A, B, and C. We want to give you more money now. We want to help you now, but we're making that choice of giving it now or giving it later, and the effects that can have. And it's and it's and the benefit for everybody involved. So the second case study is a very similar situation. However, having looked at the assets of the first family, it might not have been the biggest surprise that everything was going to be okay. They had a big house, they had rental property, they had a lot of money in the bank, they had quite large investments and cash accounts. So I wanted to show you another case study. Again, similar situation. Grandparents with son and daughter-in-law and 2 grandchildren. Again, looking at what their bank statements show us, what they've got in savings, cash ISA, premium bonds. Again, we see a lot of their investments here. Slide. Pensions and property. So they've got their home. Again, no mortgage. They're both retired. Their expenditure in terms of what they want to do. What I've actually done in this, rather than show you the before and after, I've gone to their after expenditure. So you can see here they've got a one-off expenditure of the trust. Their incomes that they've got coming in terms of pensions and state pension and personal pension. So goals and objectives, again, for every single individual, for every couple, for every family, these differ. What is it you want to do? They wanted to help their son. They wanted to plan for care home fees. They wanted to pass money on to their grandchildren. And they actually wanted to check if they were going to be okay. Often the case we see with people is we sit down with them, we say, so let's talk about everything. And they go, no, it's fine. Everything's fine. Everything's okay. But when you start looking over that longer period of time, that sort of 10, 15, 20, 30-year period, you may be okay today, but are you okay going forward? And if not, how can that be rectified? So here we've got 3 things they want to plan for. They want to give money to the grandchildren. Again, it's been the trust, the reasons why I explained for the last case study. Give their son £3,000 each, and plan for £15,000 a year each for care home fees from the age of 90. So how does their financial master plan look? So we can see the expenditure goes up at 90, but these guys actually have a shortfall, and the shortfall is when they are 95. So for now, they've still got 25 years until this happens, but there is a shortfall. As they're retired, they're very unlikely to go out and get a job and start earning money and start saving money. There's sort of 2 stages of life. There's accumulation while you're working and decumulation when you're in retirement. You're not going to, at 75, very few people are going to say, actually, I realise in 5 years' time, I'm going to have a shortfall. I need to go out and start earning a living, when they've been doing that so far and they've accepted that they're retired. So we speak with clients and say, well, okay, so this is the situation. How would you feel at this point here? What would be a reasonable course of action for you? So one thing we can show them is actually when they do have their shortfall, their property's worth about £1 million based on the 2.5% inflation growth. Is equity release something they've thought about? Would they be willing to downsize? Because at that point we've said, yes, you may not have any savings, but you still have your property. So would that be something you would be willing to do? Because if they want to downsize, I would argue it's probably easier to downsize in the next 5 years when they're in their early 70s than when they're 90. But again, that's a decision for them to make, and it's our job to make them aware of their options and potentially what they may have to do. Investment returns, as I've said, we've assumed an investment return of 4% a year over the long period. That's very cautious. We can calculate that in this case they need 4.6% a year to fund that shortfall. So if their investments do 5, everything's okay and they don't need to worry. However, that we also have to look at their investments and see, are you in investments that can grow at that level? If you're invested in something that's only growing at 4% a year, and that has done, and that's the fund's aim, then growing at 5% a year is very, very unlikely. But again, that's a discussion, because that's not just, okay, well, this fund has done 5% a year over the last 10 years. It may not do that going forward. Also, we call it the attitude to risk. Can you accept that attitude to risk? Because when funds that perform at say 6% a year will have years where they're down 10%. Can you accept that? And that's another discussion we have with our clients, is looking underneath at their investments. How are they structured? Are they performing as they should be? And hopefully going forward. So the third and final case study is looking at a couple, Harry and Imogen, 40 and 39, and their 2 children, Josephine and Lawrence. Again, looking to 100, as we've heard, the chance of them living to 100 is higher than the first 2 case studies. But really, how is this going to affect them going forward? What feels like such a long way off? Again, we find out what they've got in savings, cash ISAs, pensions and property, income and expenditure, what they earn, what they're spending, and really what their goals and objectives are. Again, they're in the accumulation stage of their life. They're sort of getting towards the peak of their career. They've got 2 children. They want to help them for university, and they've given us a number. They want to help their children get on the property ladder when they turn 30. And what they spend as well, not just year on year, but they want a car every 3 years from now until retirement of £30,000 every time. And then they think in retirement they won't spend as much. It'll be £20,000 every 6 years. They won't be driving as much. But again, they want to look at care home fees. What do they feel comfortable with? What do they think they potentially might spend? Again, it's a very long way off. But until we can put some numbers in there, we can't really show them. So again, we show them the financial master plan. The red, as soon as they hit the shortfall at age 90, is when they're going into care home. So the question is then, well, it's all well until you get to there, but what's going to happen going through? How would you potentially fund that going forward? We can see there's no issue in their working life or in retirement. Again, we would look to structure how they take withdrawals in a more tax efficient way in retirement, but that's still further on down the line. So we can see, look, they've got a shortfall. What other assets do you have? Well, we haven't said you're going to sell your house. Your house is valued at potentially 2.5 million in that when that happens, because of the 2.5% we've assumed. It may be more, it may be less. Again, equity release, downsize. What is the plan with the house? Do you want to spend more money on it? Do you want to sell it and buy another one? Those are all things that we can factor in. Again, what's the investment rate you would need over that longer period? 5.4% every year. Is that achievable based on your investments, based on your attitude to risk score? What about annual savings? How much more would you need to save until then to fund it? And it's £14,400 a year. Is that may not be achievable currently, but for us, it's about getting clients to think about these things and going, well, actually, I can't do £14,000 a month, but how about I start at, I don't know, a year? How about I start at £500 a month and start putting that into an ISA or into a savings account and start helping myself going forward? Inheritance, this is something that they think will come to them. How much, they're not sure, but again, we can factor that in and say, if you get X amount of money in 30 years time or whenever it may be, this is how your financial plan changes. So those are 3 case studies on 3 very different situations. But really, for us, when we're speaking to clients and looking over that longer period of time, we have to go away and find out what they've got. But for us, there's 3 key points. It's what the client's goals. What is it you want to do? Is it spend more money, go on bigger holidays, buy new cars, whatever it may be? And for everybody, every individual, couple, person, family, that is different. What are your worries? Is it inheritance tax? Is it income tax? Is it worried about if you gave money away now, how would it affect you? And then the last bit is what happens if you do go into a care home? What happens if you go into a care home earlier? What happens if you go into a care home later? And all those situations that come around. So I'd like to thank you all for listening to both mine and Robert's presentation. I can't see any questions in the chat currently. If anyone does have any, quickly write them in and we can answer them. This has been recorded, and I believe it does get sent out to you, both the presentation and the slides. And I can't see any questions. So if anyone does have any questions, please get in contact either with Robert or myself. And I'd like to thank you again and hope you're all safe and well.